What does open science mean in the context of drug discovery and why does it matter?
At its simplest, open science in this field of drug discovery means sharing everything, making it available to people. So that would include data, the results of preclinical or clinical studies, methods, the tools we use, the materials that one uses in conducting the research. And we do this in a way that others can actually use it.
So it's like open access publishing, but with extended sharing of data and tools.
So, not exactly. Open science not only means open access, but it also means that we eliminate the barriers to using the knowledge, and that includes patents. Patents can interfere under the traditional model with others building on it or replicating it, making use of it in, for example, the global south. The traditional model also involves working in silos, and that's inherent in the patenting process. So we don't share information, everything is kept silent. That means negative results are hidden. Others, therefore, have to waste their time replicating that work just to find out it doesn't work, wasting money, but also putting the patients who are participating in these studies at risk.
Right. So is it mainly just a question of cost or is there something larger at stake?
Well, there's something larger at stake, and we saw this in particular during the COVID-19 crisis. So, for example, we know that the mRNA vaccines were not widely distributed and they were highly effective. They saved millions of lives. And yet we couldn't produce enough. Moderna and Pfizer, who were developing these vaccines and distributing, just could not produce enough quickly enough to reach the world. And that means that countries in the global south, like Africa and much of Asia, had to start from scratch based on publicly available data rather than being able to build on what Moderna, BioNTech, and Pfizer had done. And that led to a delay of a couple of years before the vaccines became available, and how many lives were lost because of that. How many people became sick with chronic diseases because of that? So open science would have eliminated that. If this information had been publicly available, the World Health Organization, when it set up a hub in South Africa, could have used that knowledge to much more quickly develop a vaccine. They could have done so probably in 6 months rather than in 2 years.
Are open science and intellectual property mutually exclusive?
It's an excellent question, Risham, and one I've heard lots of people talk about, that they somehow think you can't have intellectual property and open science at the same time. But that's wrong. They're not opposites. They actually can work together. Open science is a strategy. How do we advance science in the most productive way? Intellectual property is not one thing, it's many things. It's all the way from patents to copyrights to regulations to privacy rights and so on. And they're tools. They're tools to go where we want to go. So they're not opposites. Open science is about setting the goal. And here the goal is sharing knowledge as efficiently as possible so that we can advance research at the lowest cost and fastest pace. Intellectual property is a tool to get there, but it's not one thing. It is many different types of instruments. Yes, it includes patents, but it also includes copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets, and a variety of other tools, including regulatory exclusivities provided by legislation. So the way these two interact is that we set our goal through open science, but then we ask, how does intellectual property and which form of intellectual property help us get there?
Okay.
All that open science requires is that we have a more open attitude, that our goal is not only to advance research to get to the final product, but to do so in as efficient manner as possible. And that means making choices about the appropriate intellectual property tool that allows us to do that.
Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between open science and intellectual property?
Yeah, they're different ways that these two can interact. There's obviously the traditional way, where everything is done in a silo. A version of that, though, that incorporates open science allows us to do work together at preliminary phases in pre-competitive spaces in the open where we share everything, there's no intellectual property. But at some point, using that knowledge, drawing on that knowledge, individual firms will patent or otherwise get intellectual property on those particular products. A different approach is to maintain openness for the research community, whether in rich countries or less advantaged countries, but find particular actors and markets where we'll charge for that. One example would be large databases or tools that are generally available for free with lots of information, but for AI firms that might be scraping that knowledge or turning that knowledge into proprietary tools, we charge them. So here it's a question more of differential pricing, differential access. And then in some context, intellectual property in the traditional form of patents doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I'm thinking here of rare diseases, but also pandemic preparedness and antimicrobial resistance. Here, the market is not strong, right? For rare diseases, because it's too small. For AMR and pandemic preparedness, it's because it's too uncertain. So getting a patent doesn't give you much, but it brings about all the costs of a patent, because a patent is not just about providing exclusivity, but it forces actors to work more in silos. There's a high cost to getting the patent in terms of the actual out-of-pocket expenses, but also the time, especially in small companies, of the people behind the research. It also slows down contracting with other players, including universities, so it could delay project start by months or even years. So in these contexts where the market is not strong and therefore patents not really doing very much, patents actually get in the way.
Right, but don't you need a patent in order to develop a drug?
No, there are many examples of drugs that are off patent and a new use is found for them. And the developer doesn't get a patent, but they rely on regulatory exclusivity, which is a form of intellectual property. It is the thing you get from the regulator, the FDA, Health Canada, equivalents around the world, when you get approval for your drug. So as any drug developer will know, you have to provide the regulator with a whole bunch of data, preclinical and clinical, about the drug and how you're going to manufacture it. Regulatory exclusivity says from the date that you're approved to go on the market, that data is inaccessible to anyone else. And that means that they have to recreate all of those studies, which, especially for rare disease or AMR, pandemic preparedness, or even for ordinary diseases with smaller market size, it just doesn't make sense to start all over again. And so regulatory exclusivities can provide you with robust protection. An advantage of regulatory exclusivities is that they don't cost anything, unlike patents. They come automatically. You also, as the holder of the right, don't have to enforce it. The government does it free of charge and automatically, which is great. Unlike a patent, which is invalidated, at least in the United States, about 40% of the time, these are virtually unassailable. So they're cheaper, they're quicker, and someone else is paying to enforce it for you. So there are great advantages to regulatory exclusivities. And while they can be used with patents, where patents present high costs, such as rare diseases, it's better just to go for the regulatory exclusivity.
Is the open science model without patents financially sustainable?
In this context, sustainability is really a question of whether the firm's revenues outweigh their costs. That is, can they make a profit? And there are many ways to get there. Patents aren't essential to this. There are other forms of protection, other forms of intellectual property that we can combine. including regulatory exclusivities. Regulatory exclusivities for the firm are cheaper upfront and cheaper in enforcement. And therefore, for a smaller firm, a startup, they're in fact more attractive than patents are because you get the protection. They're robust forms of protection and they don't cost anything. Patents, on the other hand, do cost money. So it really depends on whether you put together a set of intellectual property, which would include regulatory exclusivities. They could be also first to market. They can be branding, lead time. All these things contribute to whether the firm has a strong enough exclusivity, given the nature of the market, to be able to make more money than they have to pay.
Right. Can you talk a little bit more about regulatory exclusivities?
So regulatory exclusivities are granted by whichever regulatory office looks over, supervises drugs. So FDA in the United States, Health Canada in Canada. And it involves protection over the data that the person or the entity putting forward the drug gives to the regulator, all the way from the very first experiments through preclinical studies, manufacturing data, and through the clinical trials. So it's a whole set of data that costs years and lots of money to produce. Once you are approved for selling that drug on the market, the regulator will not allow anybody else to make reference to it. That means if someone else wants to say, if someone else wants to sell the same drug for the same purpose, they have to redo all of those studies. And if it's a huge market, maybe that makes sense. But in the cases of rare diseases or uncertain markets or even smaller markets, it just doesn't make sense to spend all that money to be second in line. The second entrant generally gets a lot less revenue than the original. And so there's just not enough incentive to redo all that work. Regulatory exclusivities, depending on the state, depending on the type of drug, is it pediatric, is it for antimicrobials, etc., can last between 5 and 12 years in the various countries that enforce it. It's enforced by the government, so once you have it, you don't have to do anything. The regulator will not approve another drug using your data unless they redo everything. So it's enforced by someone else, virtually unassailable. So it's inexpensive, quick, and you don't have to worry about enforcing it. These are complicated, however, just as patents are. And so you would need to talk to an expert exactly about how it would work in your case.
Right. So where can one find such services or experts?
You can find these experts a variety of places. There's some consultants, lawyers, regulatory affairs specialists, and so on. And we've identified at Conscience the need to talk to these specialists to help fill a gap. And so we have programs that we have set up specifically designed to help firms get this assistance and get a little bit of financing to allow them to do so through our open science asset services.
If a firm wants to adopt an open science approach in drug discovery, what steps should they take?
Excellent question, Risham. The starting point for any firm should always be, what is your goal? Why are you doing this? Are you aiming to treat a rare disease? Are you doing exploratory research and trying to understand more about the domain or the biology? Are you trying to develop a commercial product? Is that commercial product for a large market, a smaller market? Are you concerned that patients in the global south have access to it? So these goals shape how you proceed, including your decision to adopt an open science approach. Once those goals are clear, once you know what your aim is, then you ask, well, does being open help? Does it save me time? Do I get to draw on expertise of other people? Does it avoid duplicative research that delays my ability to develop? Does intellectual property rights of certain forms perhaps get in the way? What are the skills and teams and institutions I need in my partnership? As I keep saying, open science is a strategic decision, a strategic approach. It's about sharing knowledge so that we can accelerate progress, that we can speed up the development of the drug while preventing duplication, including the cost and putting the patients who are subject to clinical trials at risk. And it also can ensure greater freedom to operate because you're stopping other people from getting blocking patents. Once you've figured out your goal and why you are adopting openness as a strategy, then implementation involves a few practical steps. The first of which is asking yourself, what kinds of intellectual property, if any, do I need? What are the contracts that I need to put in place to implement my strategy? What about data? Does it need to be standardized across multiple firms or institutions? How do I go about doing that? What kind of communities do I need? Other firms, big, small, financing firms, and others. For example, if I'm thinking about using AI in my drug development, how do I go about do that? Who has the expertise? Do they need data? How do we create the data that they need? It's a substantial issue facing AI in drug discovery. But not everything can be shared. If you're using patient data that includes very sensitive personal information, or national security concerns exist, or there are other legal restrictions that prevent you from sharing, you obviously can't share. But the principle here is to share as much as possible to leverage collective knowledge so that you can get to your goal faster and at a lower cost.
Right. And what if a team isn't sure, like how to start? What can they do?
Well, guidance is almost always needed. You need an expert or organizations that can walk you through these steps and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of different approaches. We at Conscience do this, but you can also speak to intellectual property lawyers or knowledge mobilization specialists, as long as they have some background in open science. There are too many of these individuals who only think in terms of patents, and that's really not helpful to firms because you need to consider all the options. But if they do have experience, and we hope to train some and identify some, then they can be a real help in designing and implementing an effective open science strategy that uses intellectual property in an appropriate manner.
How is open science shaping the future of drug discovery, and what would it take for it to become the norm?
So open science is still early in terms of its implementation throughout the drug discovery process, but it addresses a fundamental challenge that biopharmaceutical firms are facing today, and that's declining productivity across the entire sector. The firms within the sector are producing less and at a higher cost, and this is not sustainable in the long term. So the way we've been doing things in these silos, the traditional approach, is becoming increasingly unsustainable for the industry. Large pharma recognized this actually several decades ago, that duplicating efforts is often inefficient. And so they were behind global efforts, and sometimes even smaller efforts, to conduct research in the open without patents, without restriction on use. And examples of this include the Structural Genomics Consortium, the Single Nucleotide Polymorphisms Consortium. They even collaborated in terms of the Human Genome Project. And the idea is if we did this pre-competitive work together, each one of us can later on develop our own assets through proprietary means, but we've saved a lot of the duplication of effort and the cost in getting the science right, and now we can compete later on. So large pharma recognized it. It's still novel within startups coming out of universities, and the main reason for that is that people don't know about it.
Right. But what about smaller companies? They still seem very dependent on patents, right?
They're dependent on patents because that's what they've been told, right? Smaller companies, especially spin-offs with little management experience in this field, rely on patents because their technology transfer offices or the accelerators that are helping them have told them they have to have a patent to succeed. And they're even doing this in areas where it makes no sense to do so, such as in rare diseases, that they have to get a patent that will not attract a single investor because the investor's not interested in such small markets. So these individuals don't realize that there's an alternative, and that alternative is open science that can reduce the cost of getting to their end goal, speed up research, improve collaboration, and therefore they can get to the end goal much quicker at a lower cost and still retain exclusivity through regulatory exclusivities.
Right. What about patients and funders? Do they have a role to play in this?
They certainly do. Open science and open sharing encourages patients to contribute samples or data. At the Montreal Neurological Institute, for example, they've seen a very enthusiastic contributions of data and tissues to research because the patients and their families know that even if the particular research project that they're contributing to doesn't work, that knowledge will help others. It benefits the broader community. Many of these patients know that they're going to die. They have terminal illnesses, but they still donate because it gives them and their family the knowledge that they're helping others to avoid that fate. Funders also are enthusiastic, especially those coming from patient organizations, so Michael J. Fox and organizations looking to fund in Parkinson's and so on, see the value of investing in open science projects. Why? Because the chances that any one project will succeed is low. But if that knowledge produced through even a project that didn't succeed is shared with others, that will accelerate others being able to move forward. So they see this as a great investment. Venture capital is more difficult. They expect patent-based returns in the short term, but these only work in markets that are large enough. So for big market drugs, they will be attracted by patents. But other funders, as I said, philanthropies, patient organizations, governments, are looking to ensure that the investments they make in research don't die if the project doesn't work. And open science helps achieve that.
Right. So what would it take for open science to become the norm in drug discovery industry?
Well, the biggest problem is a lack of knowledge, especially for smaller firms and spinouts from universities. So the biggest need at present is simply information and assistance in understanding the options. So we need to support those who can provide that expert knowledge to understand the costs and benefits of the patent system, but also of open science, so they can give better advice to these firms. They can also help them establish partnerships and collaborations with others. The elimination of intellectual property speeds that up. But we need to build up this capacity, and organizations like Conscience, through some of its programs, are trying to do that. Ultimately, though, open science will prove itself if it works, and that is if people start using it. So we anticipate that there'll be some thought leaders among companies, even spin-offs, that will start to play with open science. And when they achieve success, as we think they will, others will see that success and want to follow. So we simply need to experiment. We need to be willing to try out open science. And a firm doesn't have to do this across its entire spectrum of activities. It can pick, for example, a drug asset from a platform. So the platform might be proprietary, but the asset, for example, targets a rare disease. Well, they can make that rare disease asset completely open. It will show proof of concept. It will build up their reputation. It will help them encourage people to join their firm because we know that employees like to be able to contribute to the world. And at the same time, it proves the value of their underlying platform. So as firms start to experiment and use this in thoughtful ways, we think that open science will become more and more of the norm. It won't replace the existing system, but it will be seen as a contender, an option that firms ought to consider.